need to totally reorganize governance systems so that they more align with the scales at which action happens when you understand the planet as a planet, which is that on the one hand, you have planetary scale phenomenons like climate change, but on the other hand, you have the very local level impacts.
Welcome to the Challenging Climate Podcast, where we discuss the big ideas and controversies in climate change with leading experts. I'm Jesse Reynolds, an environmental policy specialist.
And I'm Pete Irvin, a climate scientist. Climate is changing. Join us as we try to keep up. In this episode, we speak with Nils Gilman and Jonathan Blake. Their new book is Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises, or Crises, on Stanford University Press. Nils is Senior Vice President at the Berggruen Institute and Deputy Editor of Noema magazine. Longtime listeners will remember our episode with Nils, which came out almost 2 years ago, when we had a very interesting discussion about climate security and avocado politics.
John is Associate Director at the Berggruen Institute, where he leads the Planetary Program. He is the author of Contentious Rituals, Parading the Nation in Northern Ireland. John and Nils, welcome to Challenging Climate.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you guys briefly summarize the message of your new book, Children of a Modest Star?
Sure. So the book makes two big claims. The first is a conceptual claim about how we should think about the world. And the argument there is to move away from the conceptual language of the global that we've inherited from the last several decades of discourse and political practice, which says that the most important things that happen on Earth are human things, and that what matters in the processes of integration that scale the planet as a whole are the movement of human goods, ideas, money, people. This is the process that we typically call globalization. And in that story of globalization, there are things like carbon molecules, viruses, other species are, to the extent they enter the story at all, are backdrop. These are things that, maybe unintentionally happen, but they're not really the primary part of the story. They're not the lead actors. So the conceptual shift that we're arguing for is to think about this world that we live on as a planet, which is at one point totally obvious. We all learn that in elementary school or whatever. We live on one of the planets in the solar system. But when you actually stop to think about that, it has really profound implications for how we live. The planet both enables everything. It also constrains us in certain ways, and we need to take that seriously. And that's basically the argument of the book, and this kind of deriving from the holistic vision of Earth system science and other scientific disciplines that have really made a turn towards thinking in terms of whole systems and thinking in terms of integration. This is the argument that we make of the planet. So we argue that the language of the global is just simply insufficient for understanding this. And one of the lines that we quote from the historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, he makes an argument that up until this point, we've used the global to refer to both processes. But he says that the global of globalization is fundamentally different than the global of global climate change. That, as we said, globalization is about these human processes, but global climate change is a process that takes place on far vaster time scales, involves things that are far outside of human intentions and whatnot. So we need to distinguish between these two categories. And following Chakrabarty and many others, we say that the distinction should be that we still call these human processes global, but these non-human processes that involve biogeochemical systems and the like should be referred to as the planet. So that's the first claim. The second is then, okay, well, we have this critique that we now understand that the planet's different than the global, but what do we do about it? So the second half of the book says, in order to take this seriously, we need really new ways of living together, new ways of organizing our governance systems, which is the kind of the core focus of the book. And for that, what we sketch out is a whole new way of governing the planet from top to bottom. And what we derive from this claim of planetarity is that we need to totally reorganize governance systems so that they more align with the scales at which action happens when you understand the planet as a planet, which is that on the one hand, you have planetary scale phenomenons like climate change. But on the other hand, you have the very local level impacts of those phenomena. So climate change operates at atmospheric planetary level, but the impacts that we tend to care about are not global averages of temperature. They're how they actually affect your community. And that's down to your household, to your block, to your family, to your city. And that these implications, I would say the same is true for, say, pandemics, which is the other big case study that we look at in the book, biodiversity. You have, on the one hand, these macro level phenomena that currently are not governed because we don't have a planetary scale governance, which is one of the arguments that we say we need. On the other hand, the local level manifestations are also not well governed because both of these things, the macro and the micro, to govern them tends to be concentrated at the national level, which is something we sketch out at the beginning of the book, how that came to be. And the argument for the second half is really that we need to kind of rethink that structure, stripping powers away from the national centers and moving some small amount of them up to the planetary scale and many more of them to smaller scale governance systems. That's the overview.
So yeah, you've got the shift from the global sort of nation state focused governance to the planetary, recognizing the interconnected Earth system challenge that has to have actions at that global level, but also details done at the regional and local and community level. Great. So yeah, your book opens up by focusing on the nation state as the sole holder of sovereignty, which is a kind of key concept in this book. Was this inevitable? And if not, how did we end up with this arrangement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the story that typically gets told about the rise of the nation state is a kind of a Eurocentric story that typically begins, if you take introduction to comparative politics in college or global history classes, world history classes in high school, a story gets told about the rise of the nation state that typically begins with the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe. There's the Treaty of Westphalia, and the idea is that every country should be sovereign. And by sovereign means that the ruler gets to decide the rules inside their territory, and that other countries don't have the right to interfere in the activities and actions that take place inside other nation states, inside other states. But in fact, the nation state as a form of governance, and today, you look at the world today, 99% of people live in a national state that is recognized by the United Nations. There's a few people left in a few small island places and a few places like, for example, Gaza, where people are not living in a sovereign national state. But really, 99% of people today live in a national state. And it's been this way for about 60 years. But if you go back to the end of the Second World War, more than half the people in the world did not live in a national state. They lived in empires, they lived in colonies, they lived in condominia, they lived in city-states. They lived in and there were a whole variety of governance arrangements that were extant in the world. And it was really only in the post-war period or the post-colonial period that the nation state sort of became the central form through which governance is thought to be properly delivered. And we have a whole story about that we can get into in more detail if you'd like. But there's a story about how that consolidated. And even in the immediate post-colonial period, there were a lot of different options that were tried out for different kinds of national governance arrangements. But by the 1970s, the national state became the hegemonic form in which governance was supposed to be delivered. And in parallel with the consolidation of the national state, a second thing grew up alongside it, which was the system of what we now call global governance centered on the United Nations, which was a series of multilateral member state institutions that were meant to govern transactions between these sovereign national states. So you have things like the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization or UNESCO or UN Security Council, et cetera, that are meant to coordinate the activities of these sovereign national states. But the action is all at the national level. Many nations have a federal system where they delegate some functions down, but the fundamental unit of delivery of governance is considered the national state. So that's the basic way in which we got there. The challenge is, as John was laying out earlier, is that we face this new category of planetary challenges like carbon molecules and viruses that travel around the globe and don't care about our borders and cannot be solved at the national level. We started this book in the fall of 2020, which was obviously at the height of the pandemic. And the book is a pandemic book in some very fundamental respects. We sort of recognized, as we looked around, that supposedly the United States was the best prepared country in the world for dealing with the pandemic. And it was a total shit show, right? And it was a shit show all over the world. Even the most fervently, supposedly high capacity national states were not able to deal or control the pandemic effectively. And that's because fundamentally the virus doesn't care about our borders. You can't just shut the borders and keep the virus out. China tried as hard as they could for 3 years to do that. And eventually they gave up. So there's certain kinds of challenges that just cannot be solved at the national level. And these require different kinds of solutions. And that's the sort of normative argument of our book, is that this structure that was built up to deal with the particular problems of the post-war period, the national state and the multilateral member state system, is not fit for purpose for dealing with the kinds of challenges, planetary challenges, that we see emergent in the 21st century.
I just want to jump in on kind of go back to the earlier period he was talking about, because I think nationalism might come up later in discussions of climate solutions and what's often seen as the problem of nationalism in international cooperation. And an important part of the story that we tell really beginning in the mid 19th century when you think about kind of the flowering of nations across Europe and nationalist movements in Italy and Hungary and elsewhere, was that in many important instances, the nationalist movements were not dedicated to nation states. They were not often at all desiring nation states. So what we tell is more of an institutional story than the story of nationalism, because nationalism and institutions did not always line up. They were always often desiring other things, whether it was autonomy within empires or other forms of statehood through which they could express their maybe political and cultural sovereignty in ways that were much more creative than the more limited way that we have today, which is simply through the nation state that gets to control everything within its own borders.
In your book, you do complicate it slightly. So you say the vast bulk of sovereignty is sort of solely held at the nation level, but there is governance happening at that sort of global network of nations at the UN, but also some other actors. Can you elaborate a little more on some of these fragments of governance that go on beyond the nation state?
Absolutely. So the nation state, since its moment of achieving hegemony in the mid 1960s that we trace out, globally that is, has never, of course, been the only governor because, as we said, things like viruses, rivers, cross borders, willy-nilly, problems like picking up the trash are fundamentally local. So there have always been governance challenges that exist at other levels. And as a result, people have governed at those other levels. So at the local level, like say, people deal with education, with trash, with traffic management. These are, the basic things of city governance. And at the other level, things like I said, river management in the case of international rivers, or the oceans, trade, fundamentally international things that happen between nation states, have been governed at other levels, some quite successfully. This book doesn't come down fully against global governance. There are many cases when it's totally adequate or does an excellent job. And we point to a couple of those, like the eradication of smallpox that the World Health Organization spearheaded. So these other layers have existed. They've often cooperated, done all sorts of things. But the problem is at the center of all that lies the nation state. And it's the nation state's prerogative to delegate powers to do those things, countermand them when they want, flip the board of the game over and go home when they're upset. And that's because of this question of sovereignty, or this issue of sovereignty, which lies at the heart of international law, at the international norms, that says that nation states get to do what they want. So some of them want to delegate to their states or provinces or municipalities or neighborhood councils or whatever it is. Some of them want to delegate to the UN. They want to delegate to regional organizations like the European Union or African Union, things like that. But it's solely at their prerogative. They get to choose when and where to cooperate. And this, we argue, is the problem, because they can interfere with or claim the right to deal with problems, even if they're not necessarily the right scale at which they should be managed.
Yeah, and so national states essentially hold a veto in the governance of anything. Right? They can choose to withdraw, or they can choose to flout rules for the most part. Now, there are, of course, lots of examples where great powers try to coerce smaller powers, or try to coerce great powers also in various ways into doing things. But generally speaking, the international norm that has grown up in the era of the United Nations is that nation states get to pick and choose what they want to participate in. And this effectively gives them a free rider problem, to use the language of economics, on the one hand. So nation states can choose not to contribute to public goods. And it also creates a veto power, potentially, for many states. If one state refuses or fails to, for example, deal with pandemics effectively, that has implications for all the other states in the world, right? And so you can't actually manage those things effectively. We saw things like this during the Ebola pandemic, or the Ebola epidemic, that broke out in the mid-2010s. Under the Obama administration, the American CDC and the World Health Organization made direct interventions into West Africa to try to control and contain the Ebola outbreak that was happening there, to prevent it from going global. But at the end of the day, those states had to accept that the interventions that were coming from the international system were things that they wanted to. If they had said no, it would have run wild in West Africa. And so this is a problem when we're dealing with things like climate change, which is the focus of this podcast, because what we argue basically is that there's two different levels at which climate change operates, right? As John said earlier, we have the mitigation problem with how do we keep the carbon out of the atmosphere and out of the oceans so that we don't have continuous global warming. That has to be dealt with at the global scale, because when the emissions come out of my tailpipe in Los Angeles, it affects the climate where you are in Europe as much as it does the climate here in California and Los Angeles. On the other hand, the actual adaptation to the impacts of those things are very different. one of you is sitting in the Netherlands right now. Netherlands is dealing with climate change. The big problem there is sea level rise primarily, right? In Los Angeles, sea level rise is a minor issue. The issues we have to deal with in terms of climate change are drought, fires, heat waves. These are the major issues we have to deal with here. So one of the things we argue is that cities or regional conglomerations should collaborate not on a national level, but on a translocal level. So for example, Los Angeles has much more in common in terms of adapting to climate change with places like Perth or Cape Town or Lisbon, cities at the southwest corners of continents that face these same kinds of issues, droughts, fires, heat waves. On the other hand, Miami, which is also in the United States, faces problems that are much more similar to Ho Chi Minh City or Dhaka, which are low-lying cities in deltas that face hurricanes and typhoons and cyclones of various sorts that risk inundations of various sorts. And so the argument is that those kinds of municipalities that face similarities in terms of the challenge of adapting to climate change should try to coordinate with each other rather than have Washington, D.C. try to impose a national climate change adaptation program uniformly from Miami to Los Angeles, because the challenges are fundamentally different. And the good news here is there actually are already institutions that are doing this kind of translocal coordination, things like the C40 network, which is a group of a little over 100 cities now that are doing this kind of translocal coordination. Or the Fearless Cities Network is another alternative network that's trying to get coordination happening between cities that face similar kinds of challenges. So that part of our argument, I think, is already being instantiated in interesting ways. I think those kinds of systems can be much strengthened over time. There's one book we lean on heavily here, which is Benjamin Barber's When Mayors Rule the World, where he laid out this kind of argument that mayors are actually key players in dealing with global challenges, because the actual global challenges manifest primarily in cities. And cities are also where most of the population growth is happening. It's where most of the economic activity is happening. And so cities are really an important agent for dealing with global and what we call planetary challenges.
Your vision of a desirable alternative system of governance across the world relies upon looking at scales other than the nation state, looking at a higher scale. And this is the principle of the planetary or planetarity discussed in your book. And there, Nils, in your response there, you started on the need to also look at smaller scales of governance as well. And you emphasize this in your book using the term planetary subsidiarity. Can you elaborate a little bit on what this means as a concept and how that would play out in a better governance system?
Yeah, so subsidiarity is a political science nerd term that we kind of unpack. It's actually one of the things that's pretty surprising for us is that this idea actually comes out of Catholic social thought for the most part. And this is not an area of intellectual history that I think John and I had any idea about really before we started this book. But let me lay it out because it's kind of an interesting story. So the term subsidiarity comes from Latin subsidium. The basic idea is pretty simple, that decisions of governance should be taken at the lowest level in a multi-level governance system that is capable of functionally addressing the challenge at hand. And so the idea is that things should be delegated down within this multi-layer system. Now, this idea originally emerges in the late 16th century, so the late 1500s, during the wars of religion in Europe. So this is pre-Westphalian, actually, before nation states. In the Holy Roman Empire, you have a whole series of literally hundreds of little sovereign, semi-sovereign entities, duchies and city-states and kingdoms. And over all of that is sitting the Holy Roman Emperor, who is a Catholic ruler. And of course, the Protestant Reformation is breaking out all over Europe. It's particularly in Northern Europe. And different cities and different rulers are choosing whether they're Catholics or Protestants. And what the Protestant leadership in the small city of Emden, which is just across the border from the Netherlands and Germany today, say is we don't want the Holy Roman Emperor, the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, to tell us who are Protestants how we want to be ruled. And so governance should be delegated down to this lower level. And this idea then gets picked up and goes through a variety of different iterations over the next few hundred years. In the 19th century, it gets actually the religious valence gets switched as Germany becomes a national state under the Prussian rule, which is Prussian monarchs are Protestants. And so then the Catholics in Germany say, oh, subsidiarity means that, if I'm the Bishop of Mainz, I should be allowed to determine, for example, educational policy in my city. That should not be dictated from the center. This then gets picked up by the Pope in the context of the consolidation of national states. The Pope in the late 19th and early 20th century, two different popes, they say actually a whole variety of decisions about, governing family life and education should continue to be the province of religious Catholic leaders, not the secular national state. So again, delegate down to the local level. decisions over key parts of civic life should be managed that way. It then gets picked up by the European Union and secularized in the late 20th century, where the European Union says, yes, we're going to consolidate certain kinds of decisions inside the European Union, but we're going to delegate down and continue to allow some decisions to be made at national or state and local levels. And so you get that kind of an argument in the European Union. And we actually do yet another kind of reversal, because the normal argument of subsidiarity is that you should push decisions down. But this is where the idea intersects with this concept of planetarity or the planetary. Because what we describe with the condition of planetarity is that there are certain kinds of challenges which simply cannot be dealt with at the national or local level. Carbon molecules, for example, viruses, for example, space junk, oceanic plastics, biodiversity loss. These are all fundamentally planetary scale phenomena. So what we argue is that a whole bunch of decisions should be delegated down, as we were describing earlier. That's the traditional understanding of subsidiarity. But there's a small number of issues, functionally specific issues, that have to be dealt with at this planetary scale. And so what we argue for is not a world government. There are proposals for world government that also date back to the middle of the 20th century. And we don't believe there should be a world government for a whole variety of reasons we can get into in a moment. But we do think that there should be these agencies that have responsibility at a functional level for dealing with these narrowly tailored technical challenges that happen and are specific to the planetary scale. And so we propose, for example, that there should be a planetary organization for the reduction of atmospheric carbon that would basically set a carbon budget for each national state. And so I actually want to spell this out in some detail, because I think this is a good example for your listeners in particular. So our vision is not that there should be a world government dictating everything and setting the rules for all of life at a global scale. Instead, this planetary organization for the reduction of atmospheric carbon would set a carbon budget. It would say, the United States, you get to emit X number of kilotons, and the Netherlands, you get to emit Y number of kilotons. Those would be binding required rules, and we can get into how that might actually be enforced in a moment. But then it would be up to the Netherlands and the United States to figure out how do they actually want to implement that. And here it becomes important to recognize that different countries will, have different preferences about the way they want to do this, partly based on political preferences, but partly based also on the physical realities of those nation states. Some places may be much more amenable to doing, for example, nuclear energy generation. Some places may have much greater capacity for solar. Some places may be much more willing to reduce reliance on individual automobiles than others. And so it'll be up to the national state how they actually want to implement that. And they may in turn choose to delegate down to local levels the actual implementation. So the idea is, again, like the budget would be set, the carbon budget would be set by the planetary organization. The implementation layer would continue to be the national and the subnational level.
So the takeaway message that I took from your book is that there's an insufficient focus on the other scales of governance. Looking downward, there's roles, increasing roles, greater roles for regional units, local units, and looking upward at a larger scale, there's insufficient attention towards the planetary. And you put forth complex interactions among these three scales where none of them are supreme. But that does raise, among other challenges, one that you mentioned, and I'd like to ask about that. What about enforcement? So if there's a body at a greater scale that makes a decision about the rate at which we should decrease global greenhouse gas emissions, zeroing out in a certain year, and then divides that responsibility among smaller units, we've tried that before. That's more or less what happened with the Kyoto Protocol. What happens when the smaller units resist those decisions taken at a larger scale?
I think the way we would answer that is as follows. Why do nation states ever give up sovereign authority over anything? And they do sometimes. And I'll give an example in a moment. But the short answer is they give it up when the political leaders recognize that A, they face some kind of a really existential challenge, and B, that they cannot solve it at the national level. So a classic example of this is what happens after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came to the brink of nuclear war, which would be catastrophic for every nation. It would be particularly catastrophic for the United States and the Soviet Union if that had happened. And at that point, actually, the Soviet Union and the United States began to implement through the International Atomic Energy Agency, a system of monitoring of nuclear tests and nuclear generation facilities that would allow for mutually understood monitoring of each other's nuclear ambitions, both at the level of nuclear power generation, but also at the nuclear weapons level. Why were they willing to do this? I mean, this was clearly having an inspection regime that's run by this international agency is clearly a violation of sovereignty. Well, the reason why they were willing to do that is the prospect of nuclear war concentrated the minds of these political leaders. And political leaders hate to be held responsible politically for things that they cannot control. I mean, this is a formula for disaster, political disaster for them. So the challenge we've had to date, and again, the two kind of case studies we have in the book are pandemics and climate change, is that so far, the pandemic that we just have been through, and the climate change that we're facing right now has not gotten severe enough. It has not reached a crisis point that's as severe as the fear that was induced during the Cuban Missile Crisis that was pushing sovereigns to be willing to give up a certain amount of authority. We believe, however, that once people recognize the severity of the issue, they will be willing to give up that kind of authority to these planetary scale agencies. One of the people who we have a quote from on the cover of our book is Kim Stanley Robinson. And so we have a blurb on the cover of our book. And that's partly because his book was quite inspirational to us. Ministry for the Future kind of imagines exactly this scenario. It's a novel, it's a science fiction novel that imagines a severe enough heat wave that kills tens of millions of people. At some point, the national states start to threaten to take unilateral action. And the threat of states taking unilateral action on climate change actually provokes national states to be willing to give up sovereignty to a central agency that will have narrow responsibility for exactly that. So we sort of imagine and try to describe the level of political science, what Kim Stanley Robinson describes in his fictional work, Ministry of the Future. And I do believe that this is going to happen, and we're trying to have a blueprint so that when this, what I believe is inevitable, severe crisis comes around, there will be a blueprint for how to actually implement a solution that will be capable of effectively addressing these challenges. But the truth is that if you look at major structural changes in governance inside nation states or in the international system, major changes of the sort that we're envisioning in this book really only take place in the wake or in the context of severe crises. We only ended up with the United Nations after 2 world wars, right? And at that point, after 2 world wars, and all of a sudden there's nuclear weapons, national states are suddenly willing to collaborate and pool sovereignty at a certain level. But it took a crisis, took very severe crisis all over the world for that kind of change to take place.
Right. So the UN's one example, but as we just mentioned, or a minute ago, it doesn't really fundamentally change the structure of international relations. But another example is the EU, which did fundamentally change the structure of relations and of statehood itself for its members. And it was, of course, these exact same 2 crises of the first half of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, that made the leaders of the European Union, all of whom at the beginning were Christian Democrats who were directly inspired by the Catholic social thought, including subsidiarity that we laid out a second ago, to really fundamentally restructure statehood for Europe. And today we look like, all these countries, they're friends, Schengen and everything like that. But you got to remember, in the early 1950s, this is Germany and France we're talking about. I mean, these were like the 2 eternal enemies who would just turn themselves into just killing machines and left a huge amount of damage in their wake. So on the one hand, you can look to science fiction to imagine scenarios of the future, but we can also look historically to see instances where states have given up, in the case of the EU, coercive authority to some new higher level. Now, to get back more specifically to your question of enforcement, we've laid out other examples where there have been, but this is a tough question and one that, you notice we don't really have an answer for in the book. Because what the book tries to do is lay out a vision, and we're very clear, we don't lay out a pathway on how to get there. We don't know, other than kind of the vague scenario that Nils just laid out of some sort of crises leading to some sort of massive structural change. But our argument rests on a world in which politics is different than today in serious ways. So, and that's where, the enforcement will come out of the fact that we're not talking about the world of today that's just in a new scenario. There would be fundamental structural reforms at all sorts of levels between here and there. So this is fully a cop-out, but it's simultaneously true. So it has that advantage as well.
Yeah. I think another thing to emphasize, looking historically at this, is that if you take the given structure of today as the necessary only way in which governance can work, you're always going to be limited in terms of the vision that can take place. Another example that I like to give on this is if you're sitting in Europe in the 1840s, which were known at the time as the Hungry 40s, and there is a famine/genocide happening in Ireland. There are massive immiseration of the emerging proletariat all over industrializing Northwest Europe. You would look at that and you would say, hey, there's no way that these monarchies that rule Europe are ever going to be willing to give up power, or these industrialists are ever going to be willing to give a decent wage to the working classes. And we're never going to have governments that can engage in some process of redistribution. And the immiseration of the working class is inevitable, and therefore revolution is also inevitable eventually. And if you had that kind of an opinion, you might even write a manifesto about that. And the thing that Marx got wrong about his vision is he didn't imagine that it was possible that national states would be willing to build welfare systems that would actually provide benefits to the working classes. But of course, we know that what actually ended up happening in the century after Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto is that's exactly what took place. Beginning in Germany, again, it was a conservative project under Bismarck. You start to have, the beginnings of a welfare state. You start to have retirement benefits. You start to have unemployment insurance. You start to have taxation systems that engage in redistribution and providing welfare states. And eventually, in Europe in particular, you cradle to grave welfare states get built that basically defang the revolutionary impulses and actually improve the quality of life for the vast majority of the population. That was unimaginable from a structural perspective of governance in the 1840s, and yet it emerged. And we believe that something like that could or can and certainly should happen in the next century. And there are reasons to believe that there are technologies of governance that may make that possible, whether it's new systems of artificial intelligence that will allow for massively new forms of coordination, or new kinds of structures of cooperation between traditional states and nonprofits and corporations. All of these things can basically be organized in new kinds of ways. And we have to not limit ourselves to think that the current structures we have are the only kinds we can have, or the current politics we have are the only kinds we can have. Politics can and do change over time. And this is the last point that I think is really key on this issue, which is that the truth is that politics has actually been a lagging variable to institutional reform in many cases. You started to get institutional reform around the building of welfare states that led to fundamentally new kinds of configurations of politics and political parties, right? So you had fundamentally different kinds of engagements in politics as the capabilities of government were enhanced in the late 19th century. So we can imagine those kinds of transformations. And I'm not suggesting that it necessarily will be government in the way that we traditionally understand it from the 19th and 20th century. It may be fundamentally new forms of governance that can emerge that will enable the kind of change and therefore a new kind of politics in the coming century.
And just to bring this point home, this is why we begin the book with our first chapter kind of as a romp through the history of the nation state, right? To show that it was built over history. It was not inevitable. It was the result of contingent decisions and political, technological, social, economic, structural forces that led to the nation state. So this is not to say that the nation state will be easy to displace by any means, but there are alternatives. And until quite recently, there are alternatives that were quite literally on the table and under discussion. So these things have changed. They will change. Let me put it this way. I can guarantee you that tomorrow there will still be nation states, but I can also guarantee you that in 500 years there will not be. The question is what will replace them?
But let me just add one other thing to this, which is that we're not actually proposing the abolition of national states. What we are proposing is the abrogation of absolutist concepts of sovereignty of national states. National states will continue to be really important focal points for politics, for identity, for particular economic decision-making, redistributional and distributional politics. The national state is the only entity that has ever been effective at changing distributional outcomes. Municipalities, it's never been really effective internationally either, but it has worked at the national level. We believe the national state will continue to be really important as a unit of economic management, but that many of the other functions that have been consolidated in the nation state, the governance functions have been consolidated in the nation state, not only are likely to, but should be delegated either up or down.
So this makes quite a lot of sense. I mean, I found the planetary subsidiarity idea quite appealing. And I think it applies really well to some examples. I think the ozone example is a really good one. Obviously, it was dealt with before your idea came along, but this was a global crisis that gathered the world together, gathered nation states together, and they all acted according to this kind of vision you have. So technocratic vision, but also you're hoping in the future to have a democratic element at that global level. But I do wonder if climate change is not a good example of where this might be applied. Because with ozone, the way I think of it, it has a relatively small footprint at the national level. It's a relatively small number of facilities, a small number of industries, a tiny part of GDP, and a couple of different chemicals need to be replaced. Climate change is not like that. Either it has a global footprint in terms of its impact, but also in terms of the sources of CO2 are near universal, and the policies to address those are near universal. So is climate change a good example of an application of this idea of planetary subsidiarity, or will we get stuck?
That's a great question. So, I mean, just to clarify, because I could see you saying two things, that on the one hand, we need to just maintain with nation states kind of being the main thing, or that you really need some sort of like global government to be able to deal with it because it is universal.
Well, that's kind of where I was going. I think it's entangled with so many other concerns. And in the book, you lean on the idea of a limit. Warming must not exceed 2 Celsius, let's say, and therefore there's an absolute limit of how much CO2 we emit. And the challenge is to divide that up. Another way of looking at climate policy is that the 2 Celsius target is a target to motivate action. And the Paris Agreement, to some extent, has reckoned with the fact that the zero-sum game of dividing this up is impossible. How do you think about that? Because surely this is a matter of trade-offs between global benefits and local costs that are very hard to resolve.
So absolutely. I mean, like, without a doubt, Paris is setting the limit at 2 and hopefully 1.5, gave actors across the board something to focus on, right? It was able to, mobilize social movements, it mobilized domestic political action, et cetera. And that's, of course, where the action that we're seeing, that's where that's happening. I guess, again, I've fallen back a bit on the idea of that, like, we're envisioning a fundamentally restructured sense of how things happen, which, again, is perhaps a cop-out. But to us, it still does seem that a focus on the one hand, thinking holistically in terms of the planet as like where we want to stop emissions or limit emissions, makes sense, because if you have, some countries committing to 1.5 or 2 degrees and others saying, we don't care. The current political economy works very well for us and we'll keep digging or keep drilling and keep burning. If you have these leaks in the system, it doesn't really matter the good action that's happening elsewhere. It doesn't matter as much, I should say. So on the one hand, you have this planetary-wide atmospheric emission stuff that you need to control. But I think if we start to think more locally about the actual source of emissions, every country releases their energy profiles and say we emitted X amount and we're on track to do this. But of course, that's an aggregation. It's not like Washington, D.C. does all of our emissions for us. It's emitted by my car, by the power plant over there, by the factory over there. And at the current scale, it's really hard to imagine regulation of those facilities outside of national structures. I mean, here in California, obviously, we have state-level structures as well. But as we're learning from various Supreme Court rulings, like the national state can say, well, screw you, we don't care. Like, we're gonna change that, right? And the national state has the sovereignty to do that, to tell California, we don't care that you have different preferences. Like, we were fully owned by Chevron, so or whatever it is, right? So this is the problem that we hope subsidiarity can get around, is that in some sense, to strip away the ability on the one hand to have regressive actors overthrow more progressive action by shifting the levels of authority. On the other hand, having planetary scale actions, which means like they can't be escaped because like they encompass the whole planet, which is something we currently don't have to set these limits. But then thinking through outside of the structure of national regulation to like really thinking about, okay, we need to replace our coal burning plant in my town, let's say. We should get to decide, we the people who are kind of living right here should get to choose what the alternative is. It doesn't need to be directed nationally. Now, the redistribution questions that really matter here, and that because paying for these things is obviously very expensive, but we should get to decide, well, do we want to replace it with a nuclear plant? Do we want to replace it with solar, whatever it is? But what we should not get to decide is we're fine with coal. That's what we think is why subsidiarity is, because what subsidiarity is telling us is the question of how much needs to be can only be resolved at a planetary scale, therefore needs to be resolved at a planetary scale. But the question of like how doesn't need to be done at a planetary scale. In fact, and is maybe best not, more democratically accountable, et cetera, to be done at smaller scales. So that's my answer. Yes, under the current system where we imagine that national regimes are really the end-all and be-all of regulation of carbon, then, as you pointed out, then you end up with best-case scenarios Paris, you could try and fail at Kyoto, but in a regime that's just simply more fluid and more multi-scalar and robustly multi-scalar, let's say that where there really is, authority and resources at a far more diffuse than they currently are, then you can envision different ways of doing that.
Let me add 2 other points that I think may address some of what you're talking about, Peter. One of the things that's very different, as you were pointing out, between chlorofluorocarbons and atmospheric carbon is that atmospheric carbon is involved in power generation and therefore is sort of marbled into the entire economy everywhere. And so it's not as easy to sort of separate it out. But this is part of why we think the implementation layer needs to happen at the national and maybe even the subnational level, precisely because the national state is the primary vehicle for making distributional decisions that are legitimate. And that is why the national state becomes the hegemonic unit in the late 20th century. It's because the central project of the late 20th century for national states, so-called nation building, is building a modern economy, i.e. a carbon-centered economy. And that is the project that national states are centrally developed to build. Building a post-carbon national economy or rebuilding a post-carbon national economies will continue to be the province of nation states. How exactly you want to do that is going to be a matter of local preference. So that I think that's why it has the implementation has to happen at the national and the subnational level. But there's a second point that I think is really crucial to emphasize, which is that particularly on carbon, national states are all very, very differently responsible for emissions. And in fact, the central challenge right now is not to get 193 nation states that are members of the United Nations and that show up to Kyoto or Copenhagen or Paris. It's actually really only 2 or 3 entities that really matter on this front. And the 2 that definitely matter are the United States and China. And the fundamental battle, the struggle has been like, how much do we account for current emissions and how much do we account for historical emissions on the one hand? And how much do we allow poorer nations to have larger carbon budgets as opposed to richer nations making the transition and paying the cost of the transition earlier? I mean, those are the 2 central challenges. And those 2 challenges come to a head, particularly between the United States and China. It's actually a G2 problem. I believe that if Beijing and DC were able to come to a accord about how to resolve those 2 extremely thorny issues, historical versus contemporary emissions and rich country versus poor country responsibilities for emissions reduction, the European Union would almost certainly fall in line with any decision that the United States and China was able to agree to amongst themselves. If there were general principles that governed this based on historical carbon responsibilities and based on relative responsibilities of rich and poor countries. If you got the United States, Europe, and China, that's already right there, almost 60% of global emissions. So that actually solves a big, big part of the problem of just those 3 entities right there. And furthermore, those 3 entities have enormous coercive power. If those 3 entities agree that these are what the rules should be around carbon emissions, those 3 units are the primary trade partner for every other country in the world. And there's nobody who can get away with a carbon regime at a planetary scale that those 3 units are committed to and are willing to do enforcement action on. And since the issue about how you're actually going to implement it is economic, regimes based on sanctions and economic sanctions are actually, I think, going to be potentially a pretty effective vehicle for enforcement and coercion of unwilling actors. And even if you have a few actors that completely opt out because they are large enough and powerful enough that they can get away with it, Russia, for example. Russia is responsible for 6% of global emissions, last time I checked. That's not an insignificant chunk, but even if the Russians completely refused to go along with any emissions reductions and everybody else was able to get to 0 emissions, that would kind of solve the problem, even if the Russians and the Saudis opt out. If those 3 entities, China, the EU, and the United States, were able to come to an agreement about how to do it, I think that would actually do the trick. Now, we're far away from that world, so it's not like that's really over the horizon. But I think the whole idea that we should have 193 nations negotiating this, rather than having the 3 entities that really matter negotiate this, I think is fundamentally a mistake. And it's a mistake that's baked into the structure of international negotiations and the idea that every sovereign nation should have an equal voice or a voice at the table in these negotiations. The truth is that Tuvalu does not matter in this discussion. What matters really is Brussels, Beijing, and Washington, D.C.
You've emphasized the different scales that are appropriate for the different aspects of climate action, that perhaps targets should be set at the global level, that the implementation of those targets through regulation and other policies can be done at a national level, and adaptive actions are best done local. There's another major element to climate action that John touched on briefly, and that is the need to pay for all this stuff. And there's increasing interest in climate change discussions, policy, and debates around climate finance. Big amounts of money increasingly need to be transferred from one part of the world to another. Now we conceptualize it as from the rich countries to the poor countries, but if we're imagining a post-nation state world, it would be from the rich, relatively the less vulnerable countries to the poorer countries to pay for adaptation, to pay for emissions reduction, to perhaps compensate for damages that have been undertaken. So while we're on the subject of speculating about the way that another world is possible, my mind goes back to what Nils said a moment ago about the way that nation states and politics were reshaped by the rise of welfare states. So might these global or perhaps planetary financial transfers have a role in some future, don't want to mischaracterize your view, post-sovereign supremacy of the nation-state world? Might these climate finance transfers have a role in bringing together something that is planetary?
First of all, thank you for identifying our really pithy language that we have throughout the book. Yeah.
Yeah, post-sovereigntist is much more accurate than post-national. As we've tried to lay out, and we believe the nation does now and will continue to have really important functions, particularly in terms of economic management. And that's also going to be important for dealing with the finance and the transfer issues that you're talking about. I think that there's probably two levels at which we can talk about this that are relevant. One is the development of technologies that can allow for a green energy transition. And here we're not necessarily talking about direct financial transfers. We're really talking about technology transfer. Should there be a technology licensing arrangement? Now, of course, actually building the technology, building the solar arrays, building the nuclear power, these are expensive propositions, and there may need to be transfers of money to make those things happen. I think it would be wise, for example, if at a global scale, we made a decision that the electrification of Africa should take place with nuclear or primarily with renewables, rather than having build carbon-centered economies that mirror the kind of carbon-centered economies that were built in the global north in the 19th and 20th centuries. That would be a wise thing for us to do. In the same way that it would be wise for us to transfer vaccines to deal with pandemics to the global south. So I think that at the level of mitigation, technology transfer is the central part of the game. Obviously, money is involved in that, but it's really a technology transfer story. At the level of adaptation, that's really is a matter of money. And some of this is already beginning to happen a little bit again at this translocal level. One of the examples we talk about is the collaboration that's happening between Rotterdam in the Netherlands and Jakarta in Indonesia. These are places on the opposite sides of the world. And actually, of course, there's an interesting historical relationship. Jakarta, Indonesia used to be a Dutch colony until the 1940s. And now there's a municipal to municipality relationship because both Jakarta and Rotterdam are cities that are at or below sea level and are sinking. And the Rotterdam government is sharing best practices about how to build a water resilient city with Jakarta. And so there are already things happening at the translocal level to enable adaptation and best practices, expertise networks, to some extent technology transfers and so on. So I think some of those things are already happening, but it's going to be a really important part of the story. I mean, no question. There's got to be lateral transfers of resources, expertise, and knowledge.
Another point, and not something we really get into much detail in the book, it's maybe hinted at here and there, but is the thought that in the present, we obviously think on national scales, and there's these very strong politics that says, like, why should we help you poor, undeserving people, right? I mean, we just, we live in a fundamentally unjust world, without a doubt, and the appetite for redistribution is not strong. Now, one reason for that, we might argue, is because all of our identities are focused at the national level, right? We have flags and wave them around and chant USA or whatever it is, because that's how we imagine the world, right? That we look at a map and you look at, and it's divided up into 193 pieces of land that are all different colors, and we understand that we're this one, you guys are that one. But if we start to think more in terms of the planet, that's a fundamentally different shift, or a shift to a fundamentally different self-conception. And this is not a new claim. I mean, claims of cosmopolitanism go back thousands of years. But clearly we're drawing on this strain that says, well, what kind of world is possible if we were to actually identify as citizens of planet Earth rather than citizens of a particular nation state? What sort of moral claims can be made? What sort of political commitments are there? And one thing a point we make in the book, and this again comes out of history, is the story we normally tell of the nation state is that you have national movements arise who then demand a nation state. So the idea of the nation precedes the state. But we now know from decades of scholarship that that's largely not true, that nation states precede nations, right? There's the famous quote from Italian nationalists right after Italian unification in the 19th century, who said, well, we've made Italy, now we have to make Italians. So institutions actually tend to predate the idea and identification with the nation, because the nation state is what then provides the national schooling and the national language that really makes people feel Italian, as opposed to Roman or Sicilian or whatever, tiny village you live in Tuscany. So you could imagine that we basically build these planetary institutions. People see that they work, people see that, and then suddenly you're like, okay, now you start to identify at a different level and start to understand, hey, we're all in this together, because I hate to break it to people, we are. And this opens up kind of new potential for politics. And, maybe this is wishful thinking, but, there's a lot of historical data to point that institutional shifts do lead to shifts in identification, and shifts in identification, kind of widening the circle of the we, who counts, who matters, who belongs, leads to new forms of solidarities and politics.
So if we form this planetary governance, we might become a planetary people.
It's plausible. And I think the point is that it's more plausible that planetary peoplehood follows institutions than the other way around. Because you often hear well, We don't think of ourselves as a world. We're not one world. How can we have one planetary institution? And the answer is, well, because you're thinking the wrong way. I mean, the expectation has to go the other way. The institutions come first. Identifications follow later.
Well, excellent. Our guests have been Nils Gilman and Jonathan Blake. Their new book is Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises, which is available now from Stanford University Press. Thanks for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for listening. Please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/challengingclimate.